Ahoy hoy, I'm Planet Walk, and in case you didn't know, I am an atheist. I have many videos on my channel arguing against intelligent design, but I don't just stick to that. I also talk about all kinds of pseudoscience. So if a well-known atheist is making arguments based on misinformation, then I'm not going to ignore it just because they're an atheist. That's why today we are talking about Richard Dawkins. Now the video that we're going to be looking at today is from a couple of years ago, but as far as I can tell, Richard Dawkins' arguments haven't really changed all that much since. After all, in an email exchange with Rationality Rules, he said that he was done with all the trans stuff and didn't want to talk about it anymore, so I very much doubt that his views had shifted much since then because there would be no conversation that he's had since then. Anyway, let's take a look at the video.
I don't have a religion, but I think if I had one, it would be the religion of reality. And it's a pleasure to meet Helen Joyce here, as I haven't met her before. I wanted to meet her ever since reading her wonderful book, Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. Science is all about reality, and science and reality have come up against some competition, some opposition, and Helen has been in the forefront of fighting against some of this opposition.
So to start with, trans people and people who support us aren't in by the way, I should probably mention that I'm trans in case you hadn't figured that out. But we aren't in opposition to science or reality. In fact, as a trans person, I use the fruits of science all the time in order to feel more comfortable in my body. I don't just take estrogen because, oh, well, cis women have estrogen in their bodies, so I should too. No, I take it because it actually changes my body. And oftentimes when people say that we're anti-science or anti-reality, they're not actually understanding the conversation that's being had and not actually listening to the arguments that we're making. It'd be very much like if there was some hypothetical individual that called themselves a Christian, and I, as a staunch atheist, went up to them and said, "You're anti-science, you're anti-reality because you believe in a sky daddy, and you believe in a global flood, which is just ridiculous, you're anti-science because of that." However, this completely hypothetical made-up Christian may not actually believe any of the things that I've accused them of believing. They may not believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible. They may not even believe in a literal God. This person might just think that Christianity has values that should be embraced. They're not so much a fundamentalist Christian, but more of a cultural Christian. It would be disingenuous to argue against that person as though they were a fundamentalist, and I'm sure you would agree, wouldn't you, Mr. Dawkins?
There's a character in a Kingsley Amis novel, I think, who gets interviewed on television, and the interviewer tells him who he is and what he does and how long he's done it. And so that's a typical trope of television, to tell the interviewee about herself.
Okay, I swear that I had not watched this part of the video yet when I recorded that last part. I have not pre-watched this video at all. But yeah, it would be very much a shame if this interview leaned into the trope of telling people who they are or what they believe without any voices from those people. Wouldn't it? This interview is just going to have a complete lack of self-awareness, I can already tell.
Well, I work for an advocacy organisation called Sex Matters now, but my background has been rather varied. 2 years realised that wasn't a great idea and went and did a degree in maths in Trinity College Dublin, and I stayed and did my master's in Cambridge and my PhD in maths at UCL in London. And then in 2005 I joined The Economist as the education correspondent. And one fateful day in 2017, the editor sat down beside me at lunch and said, "Why do the kids keep coming home and saying such and such is trans?" And I said, "I have no idea, shall I look into it for you?"
So it seems like Helen Joyce is someone that has no background in understanding trans people or understanding queer people in general. Like, I'm sure she's really good at maths, I have no doubt about that whatsoever, but just because you are really good at one subject doesn't mean that that is necessarily going to translate well to another subject. Like, as I've said in previous videos, I think I'm pretty good at programming, but if you tell me to fix a broken computer, well, programming doesn't translate well to that because Programming is for computers that work, not ones that are broken. That's a different area of expertise. Now, it's okay to talk about things that you're not an expert in, but if you're going ahead and publishing a book on a subject that you have no background in, then I do not think that your view contains any more weight than my own.
And my first attempt to find an author, I found somebody who had been through a lot of queer theory and gender studies at university and managed to write 3 pages about people identifying as male or female, man or woman, without ever mentioning that sex is about reproduction, and that the sexes are reproductive roles, and that they're evolved categories.
That is probably because they were talking about male and female in the context of gender, not sex. You see, you gotta understand this stuff before you decide to write a book on it.
And I had to bin that piece, and I ended up writing it myself.
So you dismiss someone who has actually studied this stuff because you thought that you knew better. Well, I guess she doesn't have a problem with Nigel Cheesy Hands or Terence Howard.
Oops.
It is a very odd phenomenon because I'm used to continua wherever I look. I mean, there's tall versus short, fat versus thin, old versus young. All these things are a smooth continuum. The one thing that isn't is sex. I mean, sex really is binary. There's no question about it. You're either male or female, and it's absolutely clear. You can do it on gamete size, you can do it on chromosomes.
Well, when you classify sex by chromosomes, it's not very binary. Sure, you have the main ones of XX and XY, but you also have XXY, you also have X none, you also have XXX. There are many different combinations. With gametes, it's a little bit closer to a binary as you've got large and small gametes, but there are still the options of not producing gametes or producing both sets of gametes. In order to properly make sex a binary, there have to be other things that we look for instead of just chromosomes or just gametes. Otherwise, it is not a binary. And also, when we're talking about sex, we're not really talking about trans people. If we were talking about trans people, we would more be talking about gender because that is more related to trans people. I don't care what my chromosomes are, they do not determine what my gender is. Now, I know that people will say, oh, you're anti-science because of that, but if you actually go ahead and read what science has to say about gender, then you would find that it agrees with me.
To me, as a biologist, distinctly weird that people can simply declare, I am a woman, though I have a penis. That seems to me to be a strange distortion of language, because language is useful as something to express your thoughts clearly.
Well, language is descriptive, not prescriptive, and so when we talk about things, we have to work out what exactly we're trying to describe. So if I say to someone that I am a woman, am I trying to describe what genitals I have? No, because it's none of their business. If I say to someone that I'm a woman, then what I am describing there is my gender identity, which for some people can be helpful. It's kind of like how some people say, oh, my preferred pronouns are she, her. They're not trying to say, I have a vagina. They're trying to say, please refer to me this way.
While I'm about it, I could recommend a couple of other books. Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier.
So the book that, from what I've heard, references a study that is regarded as pseudoscience because its methodology essentially chose for the results that they wanted. If you want to say that trans people are anti-science, I find it a good idea to not recommend books that are anti-science themselves.
About particularly focusing on young girls and how they get misled.
Richard, you are a scientist. You should know that it's scientific papers that are the things that you should be reading. Because, look, I've got a book here that says scientific facts in the Bible. Do you think that means that there are a bunch of scientific facts in the Bible? Or hell, you could even maybe open up a science textbook, which many of them say gender and sex are not the same thing.
And this one, Material Girls by Kathleen Stocker.
So there's a big problem here, and I think that it speaks to a bigger problem when it comes to this whole conversation. We are either the trans people or the trans allies. You're solely reading books from people that are anti-trans. Like, if all the media that you consume is anti-trans, then of course your view of trans people is going to be negative. Why don't you talk to someone who is pro-trans? Like maybe a trans person or a trans ally. Rationality Rules reached out to you and you turned him down. By only having conversations with people that agree with you on this subject, you're essentially building an echo chamber where your views on the subject don't get challenged at all. And there is also a larger issue of oftentimes when conversations are had about trans people, there is no trans people in that conversation whatsoever. And in the case of Richard Dawkins, it's worse than that because not only are there no trans people, there's no one there that disagrees with Richard Dawkins. It's just two people that agree with each other talking about a subject that, let's be honest, neither of them understand.
Helen, what do you think lies behind this odd distortion of reality?
I mean, I've been thinking really almost full time about this for about 5 years now, and I don't have a pat answer for you. I think, like a lot of interesting phenomena, it's a lot of things.
Okay, that seems maybe a little bit obsessive. I am a trans person, and even I don't think that much about being trans. If you are thinking about trans people full time, then what I suggest is go to therapy. It is not healthy to be thinking about trans people that often, especially if you yourself aren't trans.
I would say that when I started to write about it first, I quickly realised that this wasn't treated the same way as anything else, like just asking very obvious questions. Like, don't you think that if we allow people to self-identify their sex, this will lead to, for example, destroying women's sports or putting rapists in women's jails? People would turn this back on me and say, you think that trans people are predators.
Well, quite often it has to do with the framing of the conversation. Quite often when it comes to women's sports, it's said, oh, men are destroying women's sports, which ignores the fact that trans women are different to men. Biologically. And I have never heard of a single person who has just been able to self-identify their way into professional sports. Find me just one example of that happening. If there was an example of that happening, I assure you that I would have heard about it because, let's be honest, TERFs would never shut up about it. As for the women's prison thing, it really comes down to self-identification isn't always the best tool for everything. Sometimes it just comes down to what crime did they commit, although there can be issues with that, and would they be in danger in a men's prison? Because any woman that you put in a men's prison is going to be in danger. The only reason why you would want to put a trans woman in a men's prison is if you think they're a danger to women, and if you think that all trans women belong in men's prisons, well then what does that say about what you think about trans women?
Or you think that trans people are in bad faith, you're a bigot.
That's willful misunderstanding. And
yes, it is willful misunderstanding.
The sheer irony here, framing it as though the discussion is all about, self-ID when it comes to sports. Find me one example, just one person that has self-ID'd their way into women's sports. I agree that people shouldn't just get to say, I'm a woman, and then get to compete in professional women's sports. I 100% agree with you there, but that's not happening. You have to meet testosterone requirements. If you have too much testosterone, then they're not going to let you in. It'd be like if I said that Helen Joyce should not be allowed to go out and stab trans people. As far as I'm aware, that hasn't happened. But by framing it as a discussion that needs to be had, it either makes people think that it has happened or there is a very real threat of it happening. That is often the reason why those discussions are shut down, because you're arguing about something that doesn't happen, and all that really does is it just further demonizes trans people. Why not have a discussion about how Helen Joyce shouldn't be allowed to stab trans people instead?
And I mean, I slowly became aware that what we were talking about here was an intensely linguistic movement. Like, there isn't a sense in which a man can become a woman, except linguistically. Okay,
when she says it's a linguistic movement, I can kind of see where she's coming from, because there are a lot of people that try to say, we're arguing about science. No, we're arguing about definitions half the time. Ultimately, the question of what is a woman isn't a scientific question. It's a question about what is the definition that you accept for woman. It'd be like asking the question, what is a fish? If we're trying to get a scientific answer to that, then it may not be exactly what you'd expect it to be. Like, is a whale a fish? A lot of people will say no, but really, yes. Is a horse a fish? Also, yes. And people might say, a horse is not a fish, and that's because the definition that they use for fish is one that isn't based on science. And it's okay if you don't think that a horse is a fish. I don't think that a horse is a fish either. But let's not pretend like the definition of fish that we're using then is purely based on science. Likewise, we can use definition of man and woman that may not necessarily be based on science, but may serve a purpose of, for example, being able to help people with gender dysphoria.
Like, yes, okay, he can have operations, and some people do. Most trans people don't have any operations, don't take any medicine, don't have any genital surgery. But that doesn't change your sex.
Well, that depends on how you're defining sex, because sure, I haven't changed my chromosomes. I know that. But does that really matter? Not really. What I have changed, however, is my hormone profile. If you take a look at my hormone levels, you'd find that it much more resembles that of a cisgender woman than a cisgender man. And because of this, there are a lot of people that say we shouldn't just recognize sex as what gametes that you have, but there are other aspects to sex as well. Especially if you want to evaluate things like risks based on sex, like for example, breast cancer. I probably have about a similar risk of breast cancer to a cisgender woman. However, you're not going to find that out by looking at my gametes.
But that doesn't change your sex. I mean, the reason the female eunuch is called that is that Germaine Greer was pointing at the way that the man is seen as the full human and the woman is seen as the lacking human. She is a female eunuch. She's a man that you've castrated.
I'm going to be honest, I have no idea about what that has to do with whether you can change sex or not.
But actually, female people aren't male people lacking something, or male people lacking something with a little grow bag that you pop a baby out of every now and then. Female people are their own category.
I do agree to an extent. Like, something that I will never have to worry about is I will never have to worry about getting pregnant without wanting to. That's something that I just never need to worry about. That being said, by dividing people solely on the basis of sex, you do run the risk of just reducing women down to their biology, down to whether or not they can give birth. And I personally think that women are more than that, so we should probably try to avoid that.
The gift of giving birth is something that pervades the whole anatomy and physiology and psychology, actually.
Exactly, and if you're a mammal, every part of your body is female.
Wait, I'm a mammal? So that must mean that every part of my body is female. Thank you, transphobes, for once again saying that everybody is female. Now, of course, that is not what she meant, but I think the more pressing issue is here that Richard Dawkins is essentially boiling women down to their ability to give birth. That line of logic is oftentimes why you have men that say, oh, women shouldn't aim for a career because their whole body is built around giving birth. Also, it's not necessarily the ability to give birth that is responsible for women's anatomy and psychology. A lot of that can come down to hormones. Like, for example, I have breasts, and I have met trans women whose breasts have the ability to produce milk on their own. Oftentimes, it's just hormones, so saying that it's down to the ability to give birth is highly reductive.
But, my hands are female, my jaw is female. It's not just that I have, I'm a man with a uterus popped in and no penis.
And a large reason why those things are the way they are is because of hormones. Fun fact. My hands have actually changed on HRT. But yes, hormones do play a big role in why things are the way they are. You're making an argument for why hormones should be considered a part of sex. But yeah, hormones play a large role in why things are the way that they are, except for why my camera turned off. So really, she's making a good argument for why hormones should be considered a part of sex.
The only sense in which a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man is by saying so. It's a speech utterance.
I think she's missing something here, because when someone says, I am a man or I am a woman, they are communicating a part of themselves to you. And the part of themselves that they are communicating may be based on either gender identity or whatever their conception of man or woman is. Now, let's say that in the past I said that I was a man, which I don't think I've ever said unironically, because I've never really felt like I fit that label. But let's say that I said that, and now I say that I'm a woman. What is actually the difference between the two? The difference there is my idea of what it means for me to be a man or a woman has changed. Now, does that mean that a man became a woman? I would say no, because if we're going by the standards that I'm going by today, I never really considered myself to be a man. I was just simply told, once you're 18, you're supposed to be a man, and though I may have described myself as a man at a few points, I never really felt like one. Ultimately, it's really just how I classify myself that has changed. It's like if a straight person thinks that they're straight, but then finds out that actually they are bisexual. Did they change? Well, how they describe themselves changed, sure, but did a straight person become a bisexual person? Not really. They just found out something new about themselves. Now, in my case, I will admit that there has been a shift in gender identity, but that's probably just from taking HRT.
But one of the things that's happening is a long run, maybe 2 or 3 century move towards seeing categories and classification as inherently oppressive. So people think, heteronormative is a bad thing. Or they think that, the traditional family is constraining.
But oftentimes, they can be quite restrictive. Like with heteronormativity, if you are someone that doesn't fit neatly into a certain little box, sometimes you can be ostracized for it. I don't think that the existence of categories themselves is inherently bad, but oftentimes when we try and put humans into these categories, it can create divides and tensions which lead to some people being oppressed. Like, are we going to pretend that gay people haven't been oppressed in the past? But again, I don't think that categorization is inherently bad. I just think that sometimes when we have categories and we have ways that we expect a category to be, or we decide that a category is not worthy of certain rights, then that's bad.
And they miss the point that these things often, like when I say evolved, I don't mean like evolutionary biology, I mean that they came to be over significant amounts of time for a reason, and they're supportive as well as constraining.
So yes, sometimes categories can exist for a reason, but sometimes the reason for why they exist is important. And we live in a society that is evolving, and sometimes the reasons why a category might have been important in the past no longer apply, especially since the reason why a category might have been important in the past might have just been a cultural thing, or people having a weird idea of what's right and wrong.
So somebody like Judith Butler, for example, who's the queer theorist who wrote Gender Trouble, which is kind of the foundational text that academia uses when looking at these issues.
I get the feeling that academia doesn't just rely on what's said in a book. Now, I haven't been in academia, so I can't confirm this, but I would take a guess that they probably also try to cite things like papers and studies. Things that are peer-reviewed rather than just something one person said.
She doesn't see sex. She says sex is socially constructed and gender is the real thing. And there isn't any foundation for gender, it's just something that's made meaningful by performing it over and over again.
I'd say that she does have a point, but personally I do think that there is a relationship between sex and gender. There is a way that we expect certain sexes to be like, and we build gender upon that. That is why oftentimes back in school I did get called a girl, because I didn't live up to what they expected a boy to be like. But I only had that expectation on me because of the sex that I was assigned at birth.
Now, I hadn't come across this at university. As I say, I studied mathematics, and I spent my time proving theorems and defining my terms very carefully. So I was blissfully ignorant of the fact that significant numbers of young people are being taught this sort of nonsense.
Well, do you have a reason why it's wrong? Because sex is often socially constructed. We can try and define it in a way, but often the way we define it is socially constructed. And when it comes to gender, often that's more important than sex for your day-to-day life.
But they come out of it thinking that somebody who says, look, there are 2 sexes, and the sex that you are is the sex that you were conceived as, they think that what you're doing is imposing social roles on them.
Well, that has been what has happened. I had social roles imposed on me because of the sex that I was assigned at birth.
So I was brought up to think that what was liberatory and what was progressive was to say, well, this little person is a girl. Let's not let her stop. Let's not let that stop her doing anything. She could be an astronaut. She could be president.
Quite. I mean, I think we were all sort of, when I was brought up to think that you could do whatever you wanted to.
And I agree. I do not think we should impose gender roles on people. But unfortunately, we do still live in a world that does try to impose gender roles on people. Even rather progressive people might say, well, you're a guy, so to this event, you need to be wearing a suit. You're not allowed to wear a dress. There are people out there that will deride others for not looking like enough of a man, or for having certain qualities that they don't like in a woman. We haven't gotten over gender roles. They still exist, and oftentimes our brains will form connections of, oh, this is what a particular gender is like. And oftentimes, because of that, I think we do end up subconsciously kind of putting ourselves into our own gender roles. And oftentimes, I think that when people get gender dysphoria for things related to gender roles rather than sex, I think that a large part of it comes down to they've just associated that thing with being a man or a woman, and they don't want to be a man or a woman. For example, something like working out, that's something that you can do regardless of your sex, regardless of your gender, but it is more associated with masculinity. So there are trans women out there who don't like working out because they feel too masculine when they do so. And because they feel more masculine when they work out, they get dysphoria from that, so they'd rather not do that. In fact, they'd rather go rock climbing, which I've noticed has been a thing lately with trans women.
And it's worse than just the old-fashioned stereotyping that would have said, look, this child is definitely a boy, and if he doesn't like rugby and so on, well, he's a pufter, and let's bully him. It's now saying he's actually a girl.
Yes.
We are not saying that at all, and I think this gets down to a kind of core misunderstanding, because Helen Joyce's understanding here seems to be that being trans is something that is imposed on someone for stepping outside of their gender role. Whereas in reality, being trans is more like recognizing that there is a gender role that you're expected to be a part of, realizing that that gender role is associated with either male or female, and because it's associated with that, not wanting to have anything to do with that gender role. But there are some people that will deny that. They'll say, oh, it's because of the parents. Oh, it's because of the teachers at school. And I feel like it's an attempt to try and say, well, trans kids don't exist, when in fact they do.
And if you call them out on this, they say, no, that's gender expression, that's gender roles you're talking about. We're talking about gender identity, which is a sort of a posited, innate knowing that you pop into the world with. But nobody pops into the world knowing that sort of thing about themselves. Children learn it from the stereotypes. They self-examine and match themselves against the stereotypes.
And do you not think that there are some people that will self-examine and try and match themselves against the stereotypes that they've been told this is what stereotype you're supposed to occupy, and then realise this doesn't feel right? Because that is quite often what happens. They'll be told you're a boy and they'll see things that boys typically do and they won't feel right, not because they just don't like them, it'll be because they don't want to be a boy. So yeah, there's a big difference between simply not liking something and not liking something because it has a strong correlation with a gender that you don't want to be. And it can be hard to tell, but just because it's hard to tell, it doesn't mean that it's impossible. If you ask a kid, hey, why don't you like this thing? And they say, oh, it's because I don't want to be a boy, or it's because I don't want to be a girl. That's when they're trans, not just simply because they don't like it.
So now we say to little, what you used to call a sissy boy, that little boy now thinks that he's meant to be a girl. And teachers may say that's not what I'm telling him, but it is what they're telling him.
I feel like you should listen to other people a little bit more, rather than trying to say, oh, I know better, I haven't studied this, but I know better. But anyway, seeing as Helen Joyce apparently knows better than everybody, but still hasn't discussed why she shouldn't be allowed to go around stabbing trans people, I think we'll leave this video here. So leave a like and subscribe if you like this video, and leave a comment letting me know if you'd like to see me continue with the rest of the video. Make sure you start the discussion about Helen Joyce being able to stab trans people. That is an important discussion that we need to have everywhere. I'm being serious, you should have this discussion. The point of it being, of course, is that we're talking about something that allegedly hasn't happened. So I will see you in the next video. Between you and me, thank you for watching.